I'm even more proud and happy that he's joining us today, given the fact that we can bring a few updates, talk about a couple of items, and look into the future, because the past is the past, while it proceeds and has evidently shaped the conditions for what Ukraine can deal with and how Ukraine can fight. There is loads and loads of things which are happening at the moment, and loads of things people can be doing in the coming weeks for Ukraine to actually succeed, and we will be talking about exactly that. Buonasera, guten Abend, good evening, Thomas.
Hello, everybody. I am back, and I hope you can hear me.
Loud and bloody clear, absolutely. Thank you so much. Much appreciated that you've taken from time away from your, say, otherwise hard-earned weekend. I thought that we can talk a little bit about what we expect to happen rather than what has happened. We're very happy that finally help, so to say, has been signed off. But as a friend and colleague once said last year from the aviation side, it's all good and nice to have the money. It's the question as to whether and how you spend it and what you do with it. What do you think the Ukrainians will be doing with whatever is coming in the coming weeks, and how much of the aid actually is coming so late that they will have to give ground?
We have two problems in Ukraine right now. It's not just the military aid. So there's three things that you need as a military to, win battles: troops, equipment, and then the supplies. So the troops, obviously, everybody understands: soldiers, equipment, tanks, artillery, howitzers, machine guns. Supplies, obviously, fuel, ammunition, food. Ukraine ran short on supplies because the United States had a holdup for months, and the Europeans only now begin to go to wartime economy, and not all of them, or some countries go to wartime economy. And the other problem is that the Ukrainians had way too few troops because they didn't mobilize. And when it became clear they have to mobilize, they spent 6 months on senseless parliamentary debates. So right now, Ukraine has to give ground because they have lack of supplies and lack of troops, which is, if you combine these two, it's a clusterfuck. Sorry for the language, but it's the professional expression, because without troops, you cannot hold ground, you cannot take ground. Without supplies, the troops cannot fight. So you have two complete disasters here, and they reinforce each other. So Ukraine is giving ground right now because people were sleeping and on all kinds of continents here, American and European. The supply situation should improve now. The Americans already shipped what they had stored in eastern Poland immediately out on Sunday, right? But more should arrive. The troop situation, that will take a long time to remedy. So Ukraine in the next weeks will keep to cede ground because even with supplies and equipment, they still lack the troops.
And this is something which, well, if I go back, let's say to last autumn, when we had the Economist notice and the writings and the interview and the couple of treatises which were floated, then follow-up discussions in various newspapers, but which the then General Staff, which included General Sirski, the current, say, leader of the armed forces, and his preceding leader of the CSU, General Valery Zaluzhny, now actually in London, and recently received to the Court of St. James as the ambassador of Ukraine to the UK. General Valery Zaluzhny had stated a couple of things in his notices and in his summaries. One of them was air power, and we'll be talking about this today. But another one, actually split in 2 points, was mobilization and rotation plus training. How does this go together, and how difficult is it for Ukraine to do so, both politically as well as militarily? What do you think?
Modernization, it's a task for the Europeans. They have to deliver the modern equipment. What the Ukrainians have to modernize is command and control and training, which they should be doing because lots of training is helped by the Europeans. And that should improve the quality of the training and also the teaching of the training. Rotation, it's a disaster because the Ukrainians not only have all their units under strength, they also have way too few units in total, brigades especially. Now the Russians already know that, because the Russians can put one and one together. But the moment I realized that the Ukrainians are really in a bad spot is when at Ochertinie, what's the name of that village? There's some village and the Ukrainians pulled out a brigade, right? And replaced it with the 115th mechanized brigade, which didn't take all the positions, because I assume the brigade has too little men or too little equipment at this moment, and almost no supplies, because bespoke supplies are in short supply. And so this brigade had to fall back when the Russians attacked. And since this is a front sector that is near Divka, if I'm not mistaken, it's an important front sector, right? You would assume that the Ukrainians have reserves, at least a brigade. No, nothing. The Ukrainians had to turn back the one brigade that they took out of the front after 11 months of fighting, and had to send it back in to plug the gap. If you don't have any reserves, you cannot rotate the troops. That means you leave the brigades continuously in the front line, which means they bleed out. So the Ukrainians, Zaluzhny said it in the fall, we need 300,000 more troops. And then the Ukrainians wasted 6 months on debating in parliament. And this is on the Ukrainians, that the Europeans and the Americans have nothing to do with that. This is just a ridiculous behavior. So the Ukrainians are short on men, short on brigades. The supply situation will improve, but unless the Ukrainians raise another 30 brigades and fill out the existing brigades, 1/3, you have to raise 30 brigades, put them into the front and relieve the brigades that have been fighting for a year, put them in the rear, rotate them into the rear, and then refill them up with new recruits to bring them back up to strength, right? As it looks now, the Ukrainians have neither the men to rotate any brigades out of the front, they don't have any reserves, and all the units at the front are bled to dry. So I don't know what they were in Kiev, what they were thinking, but this is a disaster. I support Ukraine, but if you see something like that, we have to call it out, because this is a problem. Because if you need to mobilize men, and the men in Ukraine see that the brigades at the front are left there for a year with no replacements, no rotation, and a lack of supplies, no man wants to sign up. No man wants to be mobilized for this kind of war. So this is a reinforcing death spiral. Your brigades are bleeding dry, and you cannot rotate them out. And now you have to try to find men willing to go and fill out these brigades. You don't find, which means that the brigades stay even longer in the front. They bleed out even more, which means you find even less men willing to go to the fight.
It's a cascading effect, isn't it?
Yeah.
That it depresses both the soldiers at the front line and demoralizes those who should be sufficiently welcoming their service, might be willing to serve, seeing that no ammunition and less training, and therefore a higher chance of them just being wasted for nothing.
Exactly. That's the huge problem that we have here. And I don't know what the right moment to mobilize a lot of men was right after the Ukrainians liberated Kharkiv and Kherson. The motivation was high. The people were in a victory mood. Men were volunteering, mobilized at that point. Yes, maybe you don't need all those units, but if you mobilize at that point, you have a willing population that is willing to make the sacrifice. So yeah, the supply situation is going to improve. The troop situation, I hope it will improve, but I don't know.
So Ukraine actually is now forced to go the same path as we in the West have done for decades now, that we try to substitute humans by means of having technology employed weapon systems which require less human involvement, more standoff weapons, definitely more drones, and preferably, but that's our solution, air power. Now, that was number one on Zaluzhny's list, air power. We're going to talk about this a little bit later with the dual air wing, but still, as of now, there's not a single Western aviation vehicle at all in country. There's nothing.
Nothing yet. And even if, yeah, but there will arrive some F-16 this year. Problem is not enough. This will not be enough to make attacks into the front line or take Ukraine on the offensive. The number of F-16s that we will see this year in Ukraine will be enough to help defend cities against cruise missiles and drones. Like the Israelis and Americans and Jordanians and Saudi Arabians and French and British flew into Jordanian airspace to shoot down the Iranian drones and cruise missiles, the Ukrainians can now, when they have the F-16, use them to basically fly after the drones and fly after the cruise missiles and shoot them down, helping air defense and making Ukrainian cities more secure. But to go on the offensive, the Ukrainians will need many more F-16 than they're getting this year. So I think this year is a year for the Ukrainians to basically consolidate, hold the front, and mobilize men, while the Europeans and Americans have to mobilize industry. And 2025, we'll then see what happens. Depends also very much on the American election.
True. Now, the interesting thing is, everything you just summarized at the start of our segment here is essentially the resolution of what Mick Ryan said at the beginning of this year, that how he perceives it, and he traveled then to Ukraine again a few weeks later. That seems to have, consolidated that further. He stated that this year is Ukraine's year of gathering strength, as he called it, creating capabilities, training,
Yes.
getting ready. People at the beginning of the year, when they heard this, were exceptionally disappointed. They were also, no surprise, evidently everybody wants this war to be over, but you wanted it to be over in terms of winning, gaining momentum, attacking. But that's not how warfare works in the industrial age. Maybe we can talk a little bit about what it actually requires for a sustained campaign, because that requires what you just indicated, the industrial side needs to be integrated a lot more. How would you see that? How can we make this clear to people what it actually requires?
For Ukraine to go on the offensive, they need more equipment, which only the Europeans and Americans can provide, which the Europeans, which have not started equipment production at all, except for some small capabilities like the Caesar in France, like the CV90 in Sweden, like the Kateo Rosomak in Poland. Then the Ukrainians will need supplies, lots of supplies, because if you go into offensive, you will burn through artillery ammunition, and you will burn through small caliber ammunition, and you will burn through fuel and massive amounts of troops also. So you need to stockpile that, which we can't, because right now what we're producing is basically just to keep the Ukrainians in the fight. And the Ukrainians, the Ukrainians are far away from the mark of troops needed to win this war. They should have 10% of the population in the military, and as it looks like, they have 2%. And lots of those troops are in the rear with National Guard units. Yes, that's important, but 120,000 troops on the border with Belarus. Yes, it protects against Belarusian invasion. The problem is the Belarus army, under the best circumstances, can put up 30,000 men. So the Ukrainians could pull 60,000 men out of the north and other regions and put them into the Donbass where they are needed, but they're not doing it. So yeah, really difficult situation. What the Europeans and the Americans need to do is to produce more, especially into combat vehicles. The Bradley has proven itself to be the best vehicle that the Ukrainians received by far. The Bradley, there are similar vehicles in Europe. The German Puma, which the Germans just bought and they don't give up. The Spanish Pizarro, the Italian Dardo, Poland is now starting production on one. Swedish CV90. The Swedish CV90 have a not that good gun. It's a large caliber gun, but it only has 4. I think it's the magazine only holds 4 rounds. Then you have to reload. So CV90s from the Dutch or Danish or Norwegian or Finnish armies are better because they have a 30-35 millimeter cannon with much more ammunition in there. So long story short, the Europeans, the German industry output of the defense industry would be 600 armored vehicles per year, right? They have the factories, they have the 600 vehicles is the output if you basically don't hire any other people. If you work in shifts, if you work on weekends, if you work with full steam ahead, right? 600 vehicles. And the German industry has produced about 30 or 40 in the last 2 years each year because government isn't spending anything. So the Europeans need to spend more. And I'm not saying you need to spend and buy Ukraine the newest of the newest Lynx infantry fighting vehicle, which costs 50 million euros. Buy the Lynx for your own army and give Ukraine the older equipment, because the older equipment of most European armies is still far superior to the Russian equipment. But you know,
what is it with the Europeans not getting into this backfill production operation? Is that just a matter of them being bogged down by their own political perception of how to operate procurement? Can't they step out from this? Would that require, because in certain countries it would definitely require a change in law. You would actually have to declare an emergency. And if you declare an emergency, that would require that you've essentially acknowledged that there is a problem, right?
The thing is that in Europe, most defense industry companies are not allowed to produce stuff unless the government signs off. So even if you're the company Rheinmetall and you say, you know what, we start production on 50 Panzerhaubitze 2000, so we have them on stock when someone wants to buy it, you can't. Government needs to sign off that you're allowed to build one. And the governments don't sign off because they know that if they cannot sell them, or if they have trouble in getting them to Ukraine, the governments will have to pay for that. And you can tell the European governments are all incredibly afraid of spending money. Like seriously afraid of spending money. Yes, because you would have to raise taxes or take on more debt or maybe cut back some of your social services to free up this money. I mean, the British government is shrinking the British army in this situation, because the alternative would be to, for the first time in 20 years, that the Tories would have to raise taxes, you know, and like, should we raise taxes on the rich in the UK and on the corporations in the UK so we can finance defense? And the government is like, nah, we'd rather shrink the army. And I'm like, are you insane? I mean, the Germans would have to cut back a little bit on their social welfare or raise taxes or just increase a little bit their debt spending, and they refuse everything of those three. So the Europeans at this point, the only thing I can say for European governments, money is much more valuable than life or the security of their own nations, because the Polish are spending like crazy. You know, the Polish are like, you know, we take on debt. Who cares? We take on debt. Because the Polish understand one, if you build 1,000 tanks in Poland, that's 10 billion euros you spend in the Polish economy. That's like an economic incentive, you know? You grow your economy by buying and spending money for defense articles in your country. So the Europeans, it's a kind of like Konjunkturprogramm is the German word. What's the English word?
Actually, it is, well, what's a trickle-down economy in terms of defense spending? What would this be? It's Keynesian economics, essentially.
Stimulus, it's a stimulus, it's economic
stimulus. It's an economic stimulus, albeit that typically defense spending actually leads to significantly higher value jobs rather than just any normal stimulus, which is more like, you know, spray it across the economy. This is very specific because the components require precision. The components are valuable. The tasks which are required typically produce weapons, create expertise and require expertise. They build up skills which are valuable, and all in, the jobs created therefore remain in place for longer if the spending actually is in line with an overall strategy. Which brings me to the question, Thomas. When our politicians haven't acknowledged the problem in public, they are also not obligated to act. At the moment, this is how they behave. What can we do to incentivize them to acknowledge the problem? Because they're briefed. Just like now, people, the Gang of Eight, House and Senate, I think the Americans now got it. The House intelligence briefing seemingly was so sobering that there was no question that they would pass. So that's done, dusted, thank you. This seemingly has an effect at the moment. The Europeans...
Same with Macron. He got a security briefing, and then he basically went out there and was like, guys, the Russians are planning to invade Europe. We need to get going. The problem is that we have some absolutely disgusting leaders in Europe. I mean, Scholz would rather eat shit than acknowledge that there's a problem. And I mean, in countries like Italy, we have this crazy constraint by the European 3% deficit rule. So countries that would like to spend more on defense can't, because they may not spend more than 3% of GDP beyond their means. So, for example, Italy, that is at the 3%, if they want to spend more on defense, they have to massively raise taxes or cut back social services.
Or declare an emergency.
Yes, and the thing is that there's two propositions floating around Europe. One is that defense investments, means equipment, bases, fighter jets, and so on, which are bought in Europe, would be exempt from the 3% rule. Which would mean that, for example, the Eurofighter, the Gripen, the Rafale, all these the ships that we built in Europe, the tanks that we built in Europe, everybody in the Eurozone would start to buy them, because, if you spend then 20 billion on buying Eurofighter, it's a stimulus for the European economy. It helps the European defense industry. It helps us gain a technological advantage. It puts people into jobs. And at the same time, the government don't have to count that money spent on European defense articles to the 3% deficit rule. It's being blocked by the Austrians, Germans, and Dutch, because those are the most stingy countries, and they refuse. And the other proposition is that the Italians and the Spanish and the Greek are proposing this and pushing for it. And the French are proposing that, since this is a non-starter for certain countries, that they copy-paste the legislation for the European COVID relief fund, and that the European Union takes on a debt of 1,000 billion euros to buy for all European militaries in Europe military equipment, which would be even better, because in all European countries are in this program. And basically then the European countries would tell the European Commission, we would like to have 18 Eurofighters, and the other country would like to have 24 Eurofighters, and then the European Commission makes an order for all countries together of, let's say, 150 Eurofighters, helps the industry to plan. It's just on one contract instead of many contracts, and the European Union pays for it. The French are pushing for that, and Mr. Scholz is blocking it. So yeah, it comes back that we have a complete incompetent, low intelligent douchebag as the Chancellor of Germany, which is a German tradition, because you had Helmut Kohl, the last good chancellor, then you had a traitor, then you had an incompetent hack, and now you have a dumb incompetent hack. So yeah. And the hope would be that Scholz gets kicked out from his position, but the coalition he presides over is so stuck in not wanting to give power up that there's not going to be any chance there, which means that the Germans not only invest into their own defense, but also block other European countries from finding ways to invest into their defense. And then we have non-European Union countries, like the British, who say we're going to spend 2.5% in the future for defense, but when you look at the real numbers, it's not going to make any change, because the Brits would actually need 3%, because again, if you have wrecked your military, it costs always more to rebuild than to maintain. And the British Army is basically a disaster zone after a hurricane and an earthquake and a volcano eruption, and you have to rebuild. And so the Brits would need 3%. Same for the Royal Air Force. The Royal Navy is in a bit better shape, but the Europeans haven't woken up yet.
That seems to be a deliberate, the Germans would call it Vogelstrauß policy, putting your head in the sand and denying that there is a storm gathering. Now, whilst that is something which you and I can't change today, which is a pity, obviously, we'd love to have an impact. We've tried here, together with a grand alliance of people writing about it with open letters in newspapers and the likes. There was an initiative with Edward Hunter Christie and Jochen Kleinschmidt, and we had Benjamin Tallis on for this purpose to try to create more awareness. But no matter which angle you try currently in Germany, it fails to work. There's even no need to discuss anything with the Austrians because they are very, very much narrow-minded and self-occupied when it comes to this budget question. The Dutch are a little bit more open, funnily enough, despite the fact, when you said stingy, I agree with you. Yes, there is such thing as an austerity-minded and stinginess in that regard. But then again, you can be, as our British friends would say, penny wise and pound foolish. And in this instance, as you quite rightly said, it is pound foolish for the Europeans not to invest in defense. Last year, a conference organized together with the Royal Air Force, people, and this included very, very senior, serious, still serving people from Royal Air Force, US Air Force, Swedish Air Force, and we'll quote some of them a little bit later today. They all very clearly dissected exactly what you said at the beginning and just now. And that this disconnect has to be resolved. This disconnect between the politicians, the electorate, and the facts on the ground has to be resolved also by the media. Media participants at that conference then said, yeah, but you need to talk to us. You need to tell us what we need to tell the politicians, what we need to tell the public. So let's tell the public a little bit. How did the weapon systems, the specific weapon systems the Ukrainians have absorbed into their forces now work? How did the Archers work, the Panzerhaubitze 2000? How did they deal with the machinery? And the fact that the maintenance requirements, second and third level maintenance, how did this work? Can you speak a little bit about this? Because we've had loads and loads of questions in the run up to you coming up today about this. People want to know, how did the Ukrainians actually fare with the weaponry they got, system by system?
System by system is difficult because, there's so many that they got.
I know, but why don't we start with the artillery side? This is something near and dear to your heart.
Okay, the thing is that the artillery, almost all of it works very fine, very well. Some are just amazing. The Ukrainians are really impressed with the Archer system because it's fully automatic and you can really just stop, fire in a minute, 2 minutes and go before even a Russian drone can even start to dive. So it's really good. Caesar is an excellent system. The Ukrainians are super happy with it. The THEINER-THON howitzers, like the M777 from the United States, and the smaller M119 guns that are 105 millimeter caliber. The Ukrainians understand that this was a really excellent gun until the Russians started to deploy masses of drones too, because THEINER howitzers are pretty immobile. And until you have set it up, aimed it, and got ready, right now you have a Russian drone arriving and striking. So you cannot really move them anymore. You need to put them under nets. And once you have them under nets, under a net, to protect them from a drone strike, it becomes a sitting duck for Russian long-range artillery. So the THEINER howitzers the Ukrainians loved them and were really happy about them in the first year of the war, when the Russians deployed almost 0 drones. Now that Russian loitering ammunitions are flying around on every sector on the front, the THEINER howitzers, well, their time is really over, because a Caesar or a Panzerhaubitze 2000, an AHS Crab, British AS-90, those systems can move. And this war has shown that if there is a risk for you stopping and resting in a point for too long, you will immediately get struck with missiles or drones. So anything that is not mobile in the future has no place on the battlefield if the enemy gets a chance to deploy massive amounts of loitering munitions, which are kamikaze drones. So from what we see, if you are military, the artillery systems on the future have to be at least something like a Caesar, an artillery system on a truck where you stop, and while you get out of the cabin of the truck, the howitzer already does put itself into the right position to fire automatically. After each shot, the systems of the howitzer automatically adjust so that the aiming is correct. You don't have to spend 10-15 minutes to emplace a towed gun any longer. So Caesar is the minimum. Even systems that are completely automated, like the British are now buying the remote controlled howitzer 155 from the Germans to put on Boxer, which is completely automated, like the Archer also, are the future. The howitzer the British Army is buying can even fire on the move. That means you don't even have to stop any longer. You just slow down on the road, the howitzer moves in the right position, barrel, angle, everything, and fires automatically 5-6 rounds. Then you return the howitzer into the barrel, into the drive position, and speed up and they're gone. So you can fire 6 rounds in under a minute without even stopping. So this is the future. So artillery has shown us that Panzerhaubitze 2000, semi-automatic, well-armored, the Polish crap, the British AS-19. There's a little bit automatic ramming and for the round. So it's not automatic system. It's not a semi-automatic system, but it's aided by systems. Also well-armored, have a future on the battlefield. But without howitzers, the drones are just too omnipresent at this point. So without a net to protect it, the M777 will get hit by drones and be destroyed. The moment you put up nets to protect the howitzer, like the metal net that the Ukrainians are putting up and building really like cages for the M777, you put that up. Those can be spotted easily by Russian drones, and the Russians still have enough Tornado rocket launchers to then strike that immobile Ukrainian M777. So if you're a military, the lesson here is no more towed howitzers, no more towed mortars. A mortar is easier to conceal under bushes and under trees, so that's still a possibility. But if you're a military in the future, all your artillery needs to be 155 millimeters and on trucks or on other vehicles. Your mortars should be also vehicles and automatic gun laying, automatic, even maybe like the Polish have the RAK, which is a completely automatic 120 millimeter mortar. The Ukrainians love that because basically they drive to some point, they put in the coordinates of where they want to fire. The RAK mortar just fires round after round, fully automatically, tack, 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 tack. The Ukrainians drive away before the Russians even realize that they were there. They drive far out of the range of the drones, they reload, and they drive back in and fire. So this is the future of artillery.
And these interesting that you brought up the RUC, because evidently this coincides also with the discussions we had with a number of people who, for example, Mriya in Estonia, where they create mobile platforms which can just, remote controlled mobile platforms which can move. And if you can remote control an array of racks and just move them forward without troops, you risk less. And the mortar, maybe we have to explain what the mortar with its curve and its trajectory is actually good for, because this changes the way the Ukrainians can fight the war in what is currently close combat, trench warfare at times, but also urban warfare.
Mortars have a very steep ballistic curve, so you can make the round come down almost horizontally, which means you can fire at behind buildings or directly into trenches because it comes down so horizontally almost. You could do that also with towed artillery, but you would have to bring it way closer to the front than you want. So mortars are a very, very good system. And I think in the future, with mortars being easier to build and much cheaper to build than howitzers, I think we will see a lot more mortars, automatic mortars come in. I think the British want to buy the Amos semi-automatic mortar from Finland, which is a very good system. But there's still a guy in the turret who has to put every round. The loading in the rack is fully automatic. So you load in the whole rounds and then everything else is automatic. Once the system is on the move, you don't need anyone in the turret. With the Amos, you have a guy in the turret who basically puts every round into the firing system. And with the Amos turret, it's like this, that the system can fire on the move. The system can fire also in direct fire mode. So basically you can use it like a tank. The problem is always with the Amos. Since the guy in the turret sits at the same position, the barrel has always to swing back into the same position for the loading. So you lose a little bit of time. With the rack, you don't lose that time. It's just a much better system, but the AMOS costs a lot less because, you know, you replace a complicated autoloader with a guy, and the guy costs a salary of, I don't know, £2,000 a month, and the autoloader costs $500,000. So you can, but the thing is, you will see a lot of changes in artillery moving away from Taut howitzers completely. The French already decided no more Taut howitzers. The Germans went for no more Taut howitzers. The Dutch no more Taut howitzers. The Norwegians, the Swedish, all say no more Taut howitzers. The Italian would like, they don't have the money. The Spanish would like, they don't have the money because, you know, they have the 3% deficit rule. But long term, you can tell that there's a movement away from, completely away from Taut howitzers and also from Taut mortars. So that's artillery. Any questions here?
Yeah, the AMOS system, thank you for mentioning this. I like this a lot because I've a couple of friends of ours in Finland evidently are very keen on making sure that Patria expands its capacity. And that thing is actually very impressive. It moves very quickly, built on the CV90 platform. It is as mobile as you would like it, and also quite defensible. And therefore probably not as much of a, say, an easy target for drones, or let's say a movable target at least, as opposed to just a stationary one or a slow-moving other mortar unit. But it shoots 12 rounds per minute. That is stunning.
Per barrel, 12 per barrel. So it's, I think it's 24 in both. If you have two guys in the turret and you load at the same time, you get 24 rounds a minute, which is insanely fast and incredible, fantastic. So this is a massive system.
Now, they haven't produced as many in past years, but the Finns actually haven't published anything as to what the production was last year, which is quite interesting. And the Swedes had cancelled an order beforehand. People had been writing about it before. And then
the Swedes bought the, I think, no, but some countries bought the version where there's just one barrel, which is the Nemo, which is cheaper. So one barrel.
That's what the Swedes had ordered, I think, but didn't complete. The interesting thing is that in the recent statements by Patria, there is a significant increase of capital deployment in Patria. That, of course, it coincides with what the Finns have said, that they literally in 2022 started right away activating one stage of their national emergency plan. Another one has been triggered at the beginning of this year. And so they are building up capacity, stocks, and inventory for their own defense. But at the same time, they're also sending material to Ukraine, always under the header that, yes, we sent another package, not telling anyone how much and what it is. But at the same time, their weapon system industry has been beefing up their capital deployment massively. But one would hope that systems such as AMOS are amongst those being delivered.
We would hope, and it would be very good for them to have some combat, feedback, because we know that all the European countries that sent equipment to Ukraine that is modern sent also some special force guys along to learn, observe, analyze how it's employed to basically get a better tactics and idea. So yeah, there's a lot of stuff going on, but and not everything is disclosed because some European countries have internal political situations where the government isn't willing to disclose everything. Like the Italians gave Ukraine Scalp missiles, but they didn't give them directly. They gave them to France, and then France gave them to Ukraine. And so Italy is like, well, we have no idea what hit Crimea, but we love it. And the French are like, yeah, we gave Ukraine 200 Scalp missiles, and it's like all from your stocks. And the French are like, who knows? So some European countries like the Finnish or the Italians and also others, they don't disclose what they give to Ukraine, but it's a lot. Yeah, I have no idea if the name or AMOS is in Ukraine, but if you even just bring it in for a few weeks to test it, like the Germans put in the Sky Ranger for a few weeks to test it against the Russian drones, and they came back with a ton of feedback, and they're now making a version that is a little bit improved or much improved. I don't know exactly because they don't disclose it, but the feedback led to the Germans making changes to the Sky Ranger system, which the Danish and the German army and probably the British army are all going to buy to replace the Gepard, because it's a much better system than anyone in Europe has right now to fight off drones. So yeah, let's hope that they have sent all this equipment to Ukraine and are getting good feedback on it, but we don't know. Any questions here for artillery systems? Because if not, I'm going to move to tanks and infantry fighting vehicles.
We have Bilteri, Rating, and Pauli.
Please, go ahead.
Yeah, I wanted to ask about tanks, actually, because there were reports in the US news a couple of days ago about Abrams being withdrawn from the front line. And then more recently, the Ukrainian government denying this. So I just wanted to know if you wanted to comment on that and whether, a comment on the effectiveness of Abraham tanks regarding Russian drones. We're talking about loitering munitions. And do they need some sort of modification?
Yeah, I wanted to speak about tanks. If Pauli has a question of artillery, then let's do it now, or I move on to.
I think it's going to be. I think it's going to be Finnish artillery related.
Let's do the artillery first, then I move to Bulteria's question if he wants. Sorry, Bulteria, just a quick artillery question for the Finns, and then we're going to move to their tanks.
Hi, Thomas. Good to have you here, and I really appreciate your insights and knowledge on everything war related. One comment and one question. So the newer system that's like updated version of Amos is called Nemo, and I think you already mentioned the single barrel one, and that's there you don't need the physical loader, and that shoots 6 to 10 minutes. 6 to 10 rounds per minute, and the range is about 10 kilometers, and you can shoot and scoot, meaning that you can shoot the 6 mortars at the same location at the same time, and they will come to the ground exactly at the same time. So it's really handy, and I think Poland could maybe help on producing this in mass scale, because Poland is already producing the Rosomak, so the AMV vehicle under Patria license in Poland. I think it was KTO Rosomak, the official name. So they already have it. So
Rosomak, yeah, they have 1,000. Yeah, so the Poles have produced 1,000 of those by now.
Yeah, Poles are quite basic, and that's one reason I admire them. So the question is that your like view, or how you see it currently, like about the self-propelled artillery and howitzers. What is the current situation in Ukraine and Ukraine armed forces with the self-propelled howitzers? 2 years ago, they were lacking. They were seriously lacking those. But what do you think now? Like, do they have enough of those, or are they also lacking the equipment? We know that they are lacking shells, but what is the situation with that kind of equipment? Thank you.
You're welcome, Pauli. So the question is basically if the Ukrainians have enough artillery systems for their needs to win the war. Well, they have enough artillery systems to defend. I don't know if they have enough artillery systems to go on the offensive, because at that point you would lose lots more systems. The Ukrainians received a complete bewildering array of different howitzer systems, right? Luckily, NATO has only one caliber, 155 millimeters. So most of the stuff the Ukrainians received is exactly 155, meaning that they are interchangeable, the ammunition, the charges, the powder, and so on. Do they have enough? That's a really difficult question, because I don't know what their losses are. But since the Ukrainians are producing around 8 to 10 of their own Bogdana howitzers, which are on a truck, I would assume that means a yearly production of approximately 96 to 120. So if the Ukrainians are producing that much of their own artillery systems, I assume that they want to get rid of the remaining Soviet systems, because they use a different caliber. And I assume that the Ukrainians still have a need for more artillery. the question now is, I don't recall how many in total they got, but I think the Ukrainians between M109, Archer, AS-90, Susanna 2, and Panzerwitze 2, they got approximately 100, 150. Yeah, M109 should be around 90 to 100. Yeah, so 150 at least NATO caliber self-propelled howitzers, what the Ukrainians received. They lost at least 10 to 20. They're not being publicized, but you can be assured that especially M109 that are slower to emplace and slower to move out of a position than an Archer or a Panzerwitze 2000, they lost some. At 130, 155 millimeter howitzers, I would assume that the Ukrainians do not have enough. Especially since the Ukrainians don't have air power, that means you have to compensate for air power with artillery. As we have seen, Taut howitzers are not that useful any longer on the battlefield due to all the drones and the strikes by long-range Russian rocket systems. So the Ukrainians probably would like to have another 200 self-propelled howitzers. The Ukrainians have, okay, let me think. The Ukrainians have approximately, I would say, 100 brigades now. Let's take out the brigades that are National Guard brigades and take out brigades like the air assault brigades, which don't have self-propelled howitzers. So let's say mechanized brigades, armored brigades, mountain brigades, and infantry brigades. The Ukrainians will have probably about 80. Let's say 80. And you want to have at least 18 howitzers per brigade. So you have 18 by 80, you come at 1,600 howitzers you want to have. And around, because you need some reserve and you need some spares and you need some for training. The Ukrainians also have artillery brigades, right? And the Ukrainian artillery brigades, if someone might correct me here, but I think it's 12. Could it be that it's 12 now?
I think it was fewer, and that it was 10 and 2 were adjunct to other units. But
wait a second, I have it here. I have the list here. I opened my own files. I have the list here. Artillery brigades. Where are they? Here, wait. So they have 1, 2, 3. No, this is a rocket brigade, so not this one. So there's rocket artillery brigades, which have the HIMARS and the M270. We leave that out. If we look at just pure artillery brigades, it's like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 12. Yeah, not 15, they have 12. So each one of those should have at least 3 battalions. So you need like 60 for each one of them. So you have another 720. So in total, the Ukrainians would probably like to have 2,400 self-propelled howitzers, which is more than NATO has in total. So the Ukrainians definitely will need more artillery. Ideally self-propelled, because all the Soviet systems, there's no spares, and the Soviet systems like Akatsiya and Dika and so on are all not very good systems, and their caliber is different from NATO. So the ammunition has to come from Eastern European nations, and once those run out, only I think Bulgaria and Poland and Finland are producing 122 millimeter and 152 millimeter ammunition. Maybe the Czechs
and they're more susceptible to counter battery fire because they can't move as fast.
Yeah. So yeah, the Ukrainians definitely need more self-propelled artillery. The problem is in Europe, last count, there is just 4 countries, 5. The Czechs restarted it, so there's 5 countries producing self-propelled artillery. The French have the Caesar, the Germans the Panzerhaubitze 2000, and now as a replacement the RCH 155. The Slovaks are building the Susanna 2, which is a very slow production run because Slovakia doesn't really need that many. They're not speeding up production. The Swedes are producing the Archer. So I think this is all the European. Yeah, and the Czechs have a company who had a prototype, and that I don't know if they went into production with it. But so we have in Europe 5 factories who can make self-propelled howitzers. The best one here is probably the Archer, followed by the Panzerhaubitze 2000 and RCH 155. because the Caesar requires the crew to leave the cabin to fire the gun, exposing them to shrapnel and drones. So the THEINER-2 is also excellent. It's a fully automatic system. Just one thing that said the Slovakian factory is not going to produce 200 a year. They're making, I think, a dozen a year, 12. So Ukraine, yes, will need more self-propelled howitzers. Very few in Europe are producing this kind of system. The United States isn't even producing self-propelled howitzers because they have only been upgrading the M109 since the 60s. So of all these self-propelled howitzers the Ukrainians received, the American M109 is the oldest system, dating back to the 60s, but still, you know, the Americans kept upgrading it. So the M109A6 latest version, the Paladin, is pretty decent. But compared to what Panzerhaubitze 2000, the Crab and so on, all these systems are much better. Sorry, I forgot that the Polish have still been producing Crab howitzers, but I think there's quite some parts of that come from South Korea. So the production is also dependent on the South Koreans delivering equipment. So yeah, the Ukrainians, Pauli, to answer your question, the Ukrainians need a lot more self-propelled howitzers, which the West can't deliver. The Ukrainians right now, I think, have in each brigade 12 howitzers. And if I'm not mistaken, 6 or 8 rocket launchers. A lot of them are still Grad rocket launchers, you know. Nothing of that systems are really, the Soviet systems are not really, really good. What the Ukrainians desperately would need would be M26 rockets for the HIMARS or the M270, because those are cluster munitions dispersing short-range rockets, which basically, if you have artillery, you need 2-3 howitzers firing like 10-20 shells to deliver what one HIMARS could deliver with one pot of M26 rockets. The problem is that the United States haven't delivered any of those M26 rockets, and nobody knows how many exist, because under Obama, the United States began a program to destroy these rockets, because as cluster munitions, they have this bad reputation, which comes not from the NATO cluster munitions, but from the Soviet cluster munitions, because the Soviet Unions, and the Russians, when they use cluster munitions, besides dropping bomblets on the enemy and hoping to kill a lot of the enemy, the Russians use the cluster munition also as a mine. So the Russians intentionally make sure that about 10 to 20% of their cluster munitions do not detonate, but lie on the ground as extremely easy to trigger anti-personnel mines. So a whole bunch of nations signed up to the cluster munitions ban, except for sensible nations like Finland or Poland or the Baltics or the United States, which banned cluster munitions because the Russians used them so horrifically in Chechnya and in Afghanistan, the Soviets back then and so on, and in Syria now. And the Russians, of course, didn't sign on. So Europeans and Americans handicapped themselves with this treaty. The United States still has M26 rockets, which the Ukrainians desperately need, but the United States hasn't delivered any of them. But, you know, the Iraqis learned to fear the M26 because it's the steel rain that basically rained down immense amount of cluster munitions on them, of which almost all exploded. Like there was like 2 or 3 that didn't explode in every load of 600. So yeah, the Ukrainians need more artillery. The Ukrainians need also much more artillery ammunition, especially M26 and cluster munitions. The Europeans, the Caesar production is at maximum. The Archer production is at maximum. The Susanna production is at maximum. The Panzerhaubitze 2000 production is basically an artisanal, small mom-and-pop operation, which is putting out a few each year. It's ridiculous because they could put out like 40 to 60 a year, but the German government is basically not allowing it because it would cost money. And the Germans, you know, when it comes to spending money to save lives, they'd rather have the money. So yeah, Pauli's question led to the important realization that the Ukrainians need a lot more artillery systems. What the West has delivered has definitely helped stabilize the front, but you know, it's not enough by far.
Thank you, Thomas. It was really good. So we can conclude that Europe needs to ramp up the production and give more.
Absolutely, you were right to ask these questions, because I never spent the time to calculate to the Ukrainian brigades, but when you calculate the Ukrainian brigades and give an estimation of what they need, just a basic volume of artillery based on NATO suggestions, they're falling short by about 2,000 guns that we, the West, deliver to them. So basically, the West needs to ramp up production, stop building trucks and start building howitzers.
That's the interesting part. We discussed it here a few times, that we have overcapacities and existing, currently operating at margin, even at losses of capacities in our automobile industry. Currently, a number of specifically German manufacturing companies and automotive supply chain companies are forced to consider laying off people. Pirelli is currently laying off people. There is a lot of people. Michelin of France is laying off people in Mannheim. Karlsruhe, is it? Karlsruhe, sorry. And there is a lot of people laying off at a point in time where you would think that typically those industries should be configuring themselves to supply goods which should be used in order to defend Europe. It's not difficult to understand, actually, is it?
For us, not, but for German or the other politicians, this is way too much. This goes over their head, They just melt the brains when you tell them something like that. It's I'm pretty aggressive here, because after 2 years that people still have not understood this basic truths, it's just infuriating, because what the hell? What have you been doing the last 2 years?
Well, we hear now that a large grouping of people in the Social Democratic Party, but also one, as an exemption, but one state prime minister of the Christian Democrats, Mr. Kretschmer in Saxony, who has been outstanding Putinist for quite some time. But there you go. That the Social Democrats, in their response to a Congress, which the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung had hosted, used the opportunity to crush down on the so-called caliber experts, the people who are constantly warmongering. That includes you and me, of course, Thomas, but the many people who are on German television in recent weeks and months have highlighted what is actually needed, and that we need to, get serious about this. It's interesting that the German election campaign for the three state elections in autumn has started, and has started by means of attacking those who support Ukraine. And it has started with a view to next year's general election. Germany is no better than the US in that regard. We're hung over on the past election, and we haven't done much since. And now we're already holding ourselves hostage to the next elections. How about doing some work?
Impossible. You're demanding the impossible. I mean, it's kind of like, the thing is that basically Germany needs to vote in the CDU, CSU into government, because the SPD is a corrupted party that is not going to defend Europe or not going to confront Russia. And right now it's throwing itself completely at China's feet. The FDP will never allow, that's the liberal party in Germany, that's in a coalition with Scholz. The FDP will never allow to take more debt on, or to raise taxes for defense. So you have the next problem here. It's pretty bleak that the German, in spring 2022, so it was basically 2-3 months after the Russians invaded, German defense industry officials told me they can produce 600 armored fighting vehicles in 2022 if the government puts up the money. Yes, that would be like 6 to 8 billion euros, but at the end of the year you would have, let's say, 200 Leopard 2A8 tanks, and you would have 200 Puma or KF-41 Lynx, or 200, 400 Boxers, whatever you want. And if you have that, then you can basically tell Ringtausch, tell other countries, we give you that and you give your equipment to Ukraine. Or you could tell the Bundeswehr, the German army, here's brand new Leopard 2A8, give Ukraine all your older tanks that you don't need and all the Martyrs. So this was 2022 spring. In the rest of the year, they could have produced 600, because this is what the factories were built for, what the factories can put out if the government would want. That didn't happen. Then 2023, nothing happened. And now we're 2024, almost half year has gone and nothing is happening. So I'm at the position that, the Europeans, if Russia nukes Berlin, they deserved it. Sorry. Because if you're that dumb that you don't build up your defenses when basically you have the fascists next door rampaging through Europe already. What I mean, I'm not going to move to Berlin, obviously. But, this is so infuriating that the Europeans just don't get it. Some countries, the Scandinavians get it. The Scandinavians are investing. Norwegians, Swedish, Finnish, Danish, the Danish very much so, surprisingly, very, very kudos to the Danish, because I think those are, besides the Swedes, the most aggressive in the Scandinavian nations right now. The Norwegians are doubling their size of the brigades, doubling the number of brigades, the Norwegians. The Swedish are going also from 2 brigades to 4 brigades, plus 1 lighter one for the defense of Stockholm. The Finns already are the Sparta of Europe. They don't need more military because they have the biggest one under wartime conditions. The Baltics are working overtime. The Polish are working overtime. The Czech military is growing. The German military is growing since we have Pistorius as defense minister, but he wants to grow it even more. But the problem is that the finance minister refuses to give him the money. And Scholz could overrule the finance minister, but Scholz is happy with not giving the money for the military. So yeah, we're very, very stuck here in Europe with a very, very dangerous, lazy approach. I don't know if we will ever wake up from this nonsense, because there is one country in Europe that is at full wartime production and that is at full mobilization and that is going ready to wage a continent-wide war, and that country is Russia. So if you don't see that the Russians are not going to stop at Ukraine, you're delusional. That's what I can say, because the Russians are like the Germans 1938, they're not going to stop. They are they're at a point where they really cannot even stop because they have invested so much into the military sector.
It's interesting that you said this, because last year, serious people, very serious people, both Army and Air Force at different conferences said the very same thing. I remind everybody of, you and I spoke about this here last year, when General Cavoli at the then Munich Security Conference 2023 briefed Senators Kelly and McConnell. So a very serious, highly experienced Democrat, former astronaut, fantastic chap, was once here at Mriya Report on our space. And Mitch McConnell, the most senior Republican in the Senate, former majority leader, then minority leader. And Cavoli was reported to have painted a very bleak picture, but also one where he lined up exactly what had been agreed with the Ukrainian side, what results Ukraine would like to achieve, so that NATO could support them in view of those results with equipment and supplies, inventory, which NATO nations would have at hand in order to achieve those results if used, in the way we believe they should be used, albeit that we've now learned that the Ukrainians find different use concepts because they are the ones at war. We're talking February 2023. Then it continues throughout the summer, 3 big gatherings. Then the NATO summit in Vilnius, where we essentially were told that, no, this system is not coming, that system is not coming. And by the way, the Ukrainians should be grateful. I remember that very well, that statement. Obviously, that was toned down. People agreed. People came to work. The coalition, the Ramstein coalition, has held together, which is great. That's a good sign. But none of this has led to an increase in production. And thank you for highlighting the tanks, because the capacity for construing tanks, which you would need for maneuver warfare, at a stage when you can actually get mobile, and the IFVs, which you definitely will need, and the APCs to move troops, which you will definitely need, all of those could be built, if not in 2022, because people were not ready. But since the Munich Security Conference last year, one could have started. None of this is happening. Europe doesn't want to win the war, or does Europe rely on the fact that it can just, if it ever, now comes the word, escalates, that with air power, it can just simply thrash the Russians?
they rely on the air power, which is dependent on the United States staying in Europe. If you pull the United States out, there's no air power. and the Europeans are royally fucked because we don't have any bombers. We have almost no suppression of enemy air defense fighters. We don't have enough fuel tankers. So the Europeans are deluding themselves if they think they have any chance to defeat a Russian invasion by air power, because air power in NATO means the United States and whatever the Europeans bring along for the picnic, basically, because that's what they can do. The amount of, also the Europeans don't have enough ammunition. They don't have enough cruise missiles for their fighter jets. It continues. They don't have enough radar planes, which is AWACS, which is NATO. But if the United States pulls their personnel out of that, then that doesn't work either. So the Europeans are pretty much deluded if they think they can fight the Russians at the current state of their militaries without massive United States help, which the United States rightfully conditions on the Europeans basically doing their homework and not just leeching off the United States military, which we have been doing. Most of the European nations have been doing for the last 20 years, 30 years, Like, we will help bomb your Libyan forces in Libya, but please, United States, provide us with the bombs, because we never bothered to buy some, and now you donate them to us so that we fly to Libya to drop them with our fighters, but you have to refuel our fighters because don't we have the tankers? So, yeah, and we don't have the command ships and not the command planes to organize that, and they're conflicted, and we don't have the reconnaissance assets and the targeting assets and the satellites and the communications equipment. So, yeah, the Russians have even less of that, but the thing is that with the United States, the Russian military, if it invades the Baltics, the Russian Air Force will crush them in 2 days. Without the United States Air Force, it will be an even fight, and the Europeans will not have the stomach for an even fight. So yeah, it's pretty depressing that the Eurofighter production hasn't increased, Rafale production has increased, but because the French are delivering it to the Indians. So yeah, it's not that the Europeans are in any way gonna be able to defend ourselves, especially if the United States. There's one important point that you have to understand. If NATO is attacked, there are NATO commands who will coordinate the defense, and they will prepare the missions, they will command. They have the command and control, institutions, the commands that are active to defend NATO, right? The problem is that the higher commands are Americans. If the Americans pull out, we don't have an overall command in Europe. We don't have a land command. We're fucked. Because the higher commands in NATO, like the Allied Air Command, is an American command in Ramstein. You pull that out, Europe has no coordination to defend Europe. There's a Polish Air Command, there's a German Air Command, there's an Italian Air Command. Overall, none. What you're going to do? So if the Americans pull out of NATO, the Europeans have nothing that can command. It's like, what are you going to do? So wait, let me think. There is a land command, there is an air command, a naval command. Then there's the Supreme Allied Command, which is the United States commander, Cavoli, which is in Brussels. And there are 2 joint forces commands. One is in Naples, and the other is in Brunssum.
Brunssum.
Brunssum. And so let's say the Europeans are like, oh, when Russia attacks us with the American help, blah, blah, blah. I'm sorry, how you're going to defend Europe if you don't have an overall command to defend the continent? It's an American command. Yes, the structure is in Europe, but you say the Americans, let's say Trump gets elected, he pulls out, cool. So there is no commanding general. The whole communication systems don't work any longer. It's an empty building where nothing works because the Americans pulled out with their communications equipment and their communications material. So how will you defend Europe? The Allied Land Command is in Izmir in Turkey. It's an American general commanding officer. You pull that out, who is commanding a combined European offensive to retake the Baltics? Some European countries have, corps commands. Okay, so you have corps commands, but who has an army command? Who has an overall command to basically organize Yeah, it's the Allied Land Command in Izmir in Turkey, but which can be deployed anywhere you need. But the Europeans are pretty deluded if they think that they can defend Europe without the Americans.
And they could have it, but they could have it so easy by actually being a committed, reliable partner with all this integration, which has increased within NATO. To the argument James Hacker made this last year, the commander of US Air Force in Europe, and he knows what he's saying. He stated very clearly last year that we in NATO are so much stronger for having Sweden and Finland with us now. NATO as such, and this is despite the hiccups with Hungary in it, and despite the irreverence of the caliph in Turkey and whatnot, but NATO as such is stronger now.
Yes.
Hollowing it out by not showing to our American, transatlantic, and Canadian friends that we are willing to pull our weight in full, that we are willing to commit to European defense as part of what is, in this case, part of the concept of the nuclear triad, also in resisting and deterring Russia, and by now we can say the Krink. By not doing our part, we precipitate, we lead up to a frustration which can be exploited by politicians who would like to then withdraw capability, as, by the way, the Obama government already did by reorienting themselves and pivoting to Asia, to the Indo-Pacific.
Yep.
I mean, it is just, it's very strange. On the one hand, they complain about, like, oh God, the next Republican president, Mr. Trump, may withdraw or hollow out NATO, which he may well do or not. But it doesn't matter. We can still fix this by ourselves. Because if we don't give this point away, A, we become stronger, and B, there is less likelihood that there's any need for them to play that card.
Yep. The thing is, every nation in Europe spends money on its defense budget, right? The French have a defense budget, the German have a defense budget, the British have a defense budget. The biggest defense budget on the European continent after Russia is the United States. The British and the French defense budgets are not as huge as the Americans spent on the European continent. Now you might say, yeah, but it's 60 billion, blah, blah, blah. No, because the Europeans also have the pensions for the military in the budgets, right? You move the pensions for retired officers and troops out of the budgets, you get to the real defense budget, which is for the current military. And if you look at that, the biggest defense budgets in Europe is the US Forces Europe. If you pull that out, good luck. So the Europeans need to understand that if they want to not be left alone by the Americans when shit hits the fan, they need to pull their weight in NATO, which means everybody spends 2% or 2.5%, and they don't spend it on nonsense like putting the pensions in their defense budgets. They spend it on equipment, troops, and training and supplies. Because even if you have the supplies and the equipment and the troops, unless you invest into training, it's useless. And one thing for Europeans to save money, the Americans are like, the division will make a division-wide combat jump training. So the 82nd Airborne, all 16,000 troops will jump in one go to train. The Europeans are like, we are training our paratroopers brigade too, one company at a time. Because we have to save money. Because if you want to train more, we would have to buy more transport planes and train more pilots. That costs money. We rely on the United States that in worst case scenario, their Air Force will provide the planes and the pilots. So the Europeans are not having the troops, are not having the equipment, are not having the supplies, and are not doing the training. That's the United States military in Europe is the biggest military in Europe, the most capable. So
yeah, nothing new under the sun. I mean, the result is clear, Thomas.
Yeah, and if you want, you should be grateful.
Bad marks in the grade report for this year. for the school year of the European politicians. Bad marks, Fs abound, right?
Yep, absolutely. There are some nations that, I mean, Sweden has doubled its brigades, and Norway is doubling its brigades. Congratulations, you're doing well. It's still a far cry because the Swedes are doubling their brigades from 2 to 4, and in the Cold War they had 31. So yes, I mean the Norway is doubling its forces from 1 to 4, from 1 to 2 brigades, right? So congratulations, Norway, you're doubling the brigades you have. In the Cold War, in North Norway, there were 3 brigades alone, just in North Norway, which is very thinly settled. So yes, the Europeans are getting serious, but the level is still too low, and the equipment buys are still too low. I mean, honestly, the thing is that European nations are investing in our defense. It's our defense, you know, at such a sloppy pace that we will not be able to defend ourselves even in 2 years. Especially if the Americans pull out, if the Americans stay in, oh, we don't need to invest in defense, you know, because the Americans have such a military that just can crush the Russians alone. But the Americans are not going to stay in if Europeans tell the Americans basically, like, you know, Angela Merkel went to each NATO summit and promised the Americans continuously, we will spend 2% on defense. And she lied. And the Americans knew she lied because the plan was that the Germans would spend somewhere 2035, 2%. That was basically, she was promising stuff that she knew for the next 25 years will not happen. And she will be dead by the time her promise is due, you know? And if you're an American politician, you feel insulted by such liars. So the Europeans need to wake up. And yes, there are some countries that can defend, like the Italian Navy can defend the Italian coasts. Cool, but the Italian army has not enough troops to defend Italy itself. The British Navy can basically protect its nuclear submarines, but it can't land the Royal Marines. The British Navy can also not basically defeat the Russian Navy. The Royal Air Force can protect the British skies, but it cannot go on the offensive without American help. So the French can deploy a division if needed for a war, but after that division is deployed, the French army is bare, because the rest of the troops, you can pull together 1 or 2 emergency brigades, but that's it, because you don't have the equipment and you don't have the depth of trained troops. So the Europeans are left and right. Let's put it this way. Israel was attacked on October 7th. Within a week, the Israelis had 300,000 troops ready to go into Gaza. European nations would need 2 years to 3 years to get 300,000 men mobilized, trained, equipped, and ready. Now, the only country that can do that, that has the time to do that, is the UK, because it's an island. The Poles understand they cannot wait 2 or 3 years to train up that amount of men. They're training them now and equipping them now because they want to defend themselves against the Russians. The Germans probably think that, you know, we have the time because, you know, the Americans will come in and defeat the Russians first before we need to do that. So this is not how it works. The Europeans need to wake up. And, you know, I mean,
they were warned. They were warned early. I remember in 2005 and 2007 when Condoleezza Rice was in Germany and met with Miss Merkel. And whereas in 2007, I think this was still where she then very clearly said, this is not the time. This was about Iran. The Germans wanted to do business in Iran, just like the French. And the Brits were allowing it at that time because Gordon Brown's government. The Tony Blair, Gordon Brown long-standing policy was that everything which was good for business in that regard should be tolerated, and that was a major, major mistake. But
yep.
Ms. Merkel then was briefed by Ms. Rice, as was later declared, that on the ambitions and the progress of the plutonium enrichment program of Tehran, and who was behind it. And it was clearly stated that there was significant Russian interest in Iran at that point in time. And Ms. Merkel seemingly was highlighting that Mr. Putin was a safe transactional partner, ein sicherer Transaktionspartner for Europe. There you have it. They were warned. They were warned on so many levels, and they simply disregarded it.
The thing is that you can be a naive. You can always excuse yourself. You're a naive idiot. After February 22, you cannot say that you're a naive idiot. I mean, at that point, you have to acknowledge that yes, it's over. We cannot pretend any longer. I mean, also now that Iran has fired almost 300 missiles at Israel and drones, you cannot pretend any longer that Iran is a cool country you can do business with and you can have relations with. The problem is, for example, that the European Union wanted to label the Revolutionary Republican Guard in Iran as a terrorist organization, and the Germans jumped in between and said, no, Mercedes and other companies of ours are selling so many cars over there. You can't label this as a terrorist organizations, even if they are, because that would hamper our commerce with Iran, because the European Union nation, which has the biggest commerce with Iran, is the Germans. So all these stupid things to suck up to dictators in the belief that this will make the dictators pliant and nice, and if you just sell them more Bosch electronics, then the Iranians will stop persecuting women and gay. I mean, this is a stupid lie that you tell because you are a corrupt piece of shit. And the Europeans just went with it because, as you said, if it's good for business, like a Gordon Brown and Tony Blair and lots of German politicians said, like, who cares? If you by now are not yet awake to the dangers this poses and to the problems this poses, you can't be helped.
Well, there you go. Thomas, we have a couple of hands up. Brian has been waiting patiently.
We have to go back to Bull Terry. He has been so patient. I owe him that we speak about the tanks. So tanks. The tank is not dead. The tank is very good. The tank needs an active protection system. The Americans gave Ukraine 31 Abrams, the Germans gave Leopard 2-8, British gave some Challengers. The Ukrainians used them piecemeal. So if there was a Russian attack, if there was a Russian group of troops that attacked, the Ukrainians sent in one tank or one Bradley to help some Ukrainian infantry fight the Russians back. This is not how you employ tanks. The tank is a breakthrough weapon, and then you deploy it in mass. Because then if you have one tank, it's one cannon. If you have 30 tanks barreling down at the enemy, it's 30 cannons, 30 machine guns, plus the Bradleys. You smack the enemy to pieces with this mass of firepower. If you look at the pictures of American tank divisions and infantry mechanized divisions in the first Gulf War, 91, you see a mass of tanks and Bradleys barreling down, all combined towards the Iraqis, because at that point, you're in Iraq in a trench and you see suddenly 100 Abrahams and 200 Bradleys coming to you and all fire their guns at the same time. 90% of the people in the trench are dead and the rest is scared for life and runs or surrenders. The Ukrainians employed the Abrahams and the other tanks wrong. Piecemeal, which is not good. And then the Russians began to deploy drones. And, if you have a tank, the moment the tank has to reverse or to move, it's slower than a drone, you can strike it. You just have to throw one track off its wheel and the tank is stuck. Then you have to get out and run, and that's basically a loss. Then the tank is a loss. That the tank is absolutely useful on the battlefield and safe to use on the battlefield is shown in Gaza. The Israelis went with Merkava tanks and their APCs into Gaza. Hamas fighters fired 1,000 times on the Israeli tanks. The Israeli lost 2. Why? Because the trophy and the windbreaker active protection systems shoots down whatever rockets are fired at the tank at close range and the drones. So the Israeli already adapted their active protection systems not just to defeat rocket-propelled grenades and anti-tank guided missiles, rockets and missiles which fly so much faster than the drones, The Israelis also reprogrammed and reorganized their APS systems to defeat drones that come from above, kamikaze drones, loitering munitions, and so on. So the tank has a place on the battlefield the moment you begin to put on it active protection systems. For those people that don't know what those are, the Israelis developed two active protection systems, right? Windbreaker and Trophy. Both use radars 360 degrees around the tank turret or the infantry fighting vehicle turret to look for threats. So there's a rocket-propelled grenade or anti-tank guided missiles or a drone flying towards the tank. These radar systems will see them, will take a note of them, will calculate their flight path. Trophy fires then a kind of round effector. Let's call it an effector. It's basically an explosive with a shrapnel in it, like a shotgun, you know, a shotgun. It shoots this cartridge toward the target, and the cartridge detonates next to the rocket, to the missile, or to the drone and shreds it, right? Windbreaker fires a package of shrapnel already in the path of the incoming projectile. So if you look at Hamas videos from Gaza, they keep firing like crazy at the Israeli tank from extremely close ranges. And the moment there's an explosion, they cut the video, because all those explosions, except for two, are the active protection system, the APS systems, defeating the incoming missiles, the incoming drones. In two cases, the Hamas fired, like 3 or 4 Hamas guys fired at the same tank at the same time, which overwhelmed the system, because the Trophy, I think, has the magazine of the Trophy is, I think, 4 rounds for each direction, so that overwhelmed the Trophy system. And the Israelis immediately lost, like, I think in one case 8 troops, because it was an armored personnel carrier that was hit. So in Ukraine, what we see is that tanks, useful, Bradleys, even more useful, because the chain gun, which has a much higher rate of fire than the tank guns, the chain guns can just shred the optics on the tanks, which without the optics, that the guys in the tanks don't see anything anymore. And that's how you basically immobilize it and stop it. But what the Ukrainians have, tanks and infantry fighting vehicles, all of them without an active protection system. If the Ukrainians would have on the Abrams active protection systems, they wouldn't lose any. Because even if in the beginning of the offensive last year, when the Ukrainians ran into an ambush by Russian attack helicopters, which fired from 8 kilometers away at the Ukrainian Leopard 2A8 tanks that were there in the vanguard, the Israeli active protection system would defeat those missiles. What we have also learned is that the magazines of the current Israeli active protection systems are not holding enough rounds. So you don't want to have just the Trophy basic variant has just, I think, 2 effectors per each direction. So you have on the turret, each direction is like 4 directions, north, south, east, west in that case, let's call it this way, but it's right, left, front, back. So you have 8 effectors that you have to reload. It needs a better magazine, maybe 4 or 5 rounds. But if you have an active protection system, neither the drones, neither the anti-tank guided missiles, neither the rocket-propelled grenades are a danger to the tanks. The only danger that then remains are drones that drop from above grenades directly on top of the tank, which you can defeat if you make like the cope cages that the Russians put up. If you build something like that, let's say you build above the tank, you put a armor package of like 2-3 centimeters of non-explosive reactive armor, you can defeat those. So the tank has definitely a place on the battlefield. It just needs an active protection system. Israel has it. The Israeli armored core is going around Gaza without problems, which is even much more dangerous for a tank, because if you're a Ukrainian, let's say, if you're in a Ukrainian Abrams tank with an active protection system, the Russians will fire at you from a mile away. That means your radar has a mile that it can observe and analyze the rocket coming in and prepare the trophy system to shoot it down. In Gaza, sometimes you can see that the Hamas fighters were like 20 to 30 yards away from the Israeli tanks. So there's a split second between the firing of the rocket-propelled grenade and the trophy system. In under 1 second, the Hamas fighter shoots and the trophy defeats. It's a second thing. In 1 second, the whole process of recognizing, intercepting, destroying the target occurs from the APS system. So people who write, oh, the tank is obsolete at the end of the tank. The tank without an active protection system, like tout artillery, yes, that time is over. In the future, you will have to mount an active protection system on every tank, on every infantry fighting vehicle, on every armored personnel carrier, like the Israelis already do. Like in Europe, nobody does.
And you need a 360 machine gun capacity, or 1 or 2, to take down drones.
Yes, or as some countries are now experimenting or planning, they put every platoon of IFVs or tanks gets one Sky Ranger air defense system that follows a little behind with an automatic cannon that shoots down drones, observation drones that shoot down drones that drop grenades and so on. The thing is, you just have to adapt. A good military will look at the Ukraine war and say, then look at the Israeli war and will say, and then combine.
Yeah, that's the institutional learning Nick Ryan was talking about here, and that on a tactical level, Ukraine has been very good at learning. On a strategic level, meaning integration and concentration of all their war efforts in terms of producing those items which they need en masse, cheaply. The Russians have the upper hand because they, in their own sluggish dictatorship, they are able to do so at this point in time, whereas Ukraine would need to integrate with Western nations on the economic side. Very interesting part. But what you said about the tanks, of course, if you have the capability of providing the bubble, like the Gepard was once used in order to create a bubble around Leopards, that is certainly what Ukraine and others will have to do in the future. Now, we have a couple of hands up, Thomas. I would like to go to Brian and Plastic because they both have been waiting patiently. And in 19 minutes, you and I will be joined by the whole Doolittle Air Wing, including our special guest, Greg Bagwell, the former Air Marshal of the, actually not the former, he is the Air Marshal, RAF, retired, but there you go. Let's go to Brian.
Great to talk to you again, Thomas. It's been a while for me to interact with you. Hope you're doing well. So I want to, you sound a very correctly depressing um, overview and review of the lack of European ramp up of defense production capacity. I wonder what you think of the United Kingdom's recent announcements of increase in military spending, and there was even this, I saw this phrase, war footing reference here, and I don't know if that was an official term in a statement or whether that was someone providing commentary on what the British are planning. But curious to see, what you think of this announced increase in defense spending, and then if you were advising the Ministry of Defense, where would you prioritize the British spend this additional money?
Thank you. What I have seen is that the UK is investing more in defense. Very, very good. Not enough because inflation and the increased cost, of housing and rebuilding all the bases to a acceptable standard will eat up a lot of the money. So you should even invest more, like 3%, because as people are learning now, it's so much more expensive to rebuild capacities than to maintain. Like the Germans, we will add one brigade for Lithuania. Then they figured out it costs 11 billion euros one brigade because you have to begin from scratch. And if you would have maintained a brigade, you could do it for like 4 or 5. So it costs twice as much to build up than to maintain. So the UK investing more is good. It would even need to invest more because the British army is in really dire straits. Yeah, so every nation investing into more defense needs to be lauded and applauded. None of them, except for the Poles and some Scandinavians, are investing enough. So especially, France, Germany, Italy, Spain, the big ones, the UK. I mean, these are the big countries that should have the biggest investment. None of them is really, the French should be at 3%, the Germans should be at 3%, the Italians should be at 3%, and so on. None of them is, which is quite a problem. So what would I tell the British Ministry of Defense where to focus is spending? Okay, let's go back to the British military at the end of the Cold War. The British military at the end of the Cold War, like now, has as enemy that they have to fight in a coalition with NATO, the Russians. Back then the Soviets, now it's the Russians. The British military, out of the European nations, France, Italy, West Germany at that time, and the UK, the British had the smallest land army of them all, right? So if you look at it, the Germans had 48 brigades between 38 active brigades and 10 reserve brigades. The French, if I'm not mistaken, had, let me count, that were 10 and 15 divisions. So the French are difficult to classify because their divisions didn't have brigade, but outsized regiments. So the regiments were huge. So let's say the French had an equivalent of 30 brigades. The Italians had 24 active, 3 reserve brigades, 1 carabinieri brigade. So at 28 brigades, the Italians. And Britain had, if I'm not mistaken, 16 brigades, 4 divisions earmarked for NATO, Airborne Division, Royal Marines, and then 2 for the home defense. So Britain had a very small land army, but the divisions the British had in Germany, those were 3 of 4 divisions were based in Germany permanently. Those were excellently trained, excellently equipped, and they contributed massively to the defense of northern Germany. So it was 3 British divisions plus 1 division that would come in. The 1st, 3rd, and 4th division were based in Germany. The 2nd division was based in northern England and would have come in as a reinforcement, as would have come in the parachute regiment. And today, Britain couldn't barely muster 1 heavy brigade for NATO to help in a ground war, right? The main focus of the British military in the Cold War was not on the ground forces. As I said, compared to Italy and Germany and France, the British had by far the smallest ground force. Britain focused on 2 things: air power and naval power. So the Royal Navy at the end of the Cold War had like 5 times more ships than now, with the task of bottling up the Soviet fleets trying to come out of Murmansk in the north through the gaps between Greenland and Norway, and then Greenland, Iceland, and the UK. They would have been helped by the United States Navy and the Norwegian Navy in that task. So this was one of the main focus of the British military at the end of the Cold War, to bottle up the Soviet fleets. Why? Because if the Soviet fleets can move from the North Arctic oceans, over between between Spitsberg, Greenland, Iceland, in that area, if the Soviets can move from that into the Atlantic.
Svalbard. You mean Svalbard?
Svalbard. Yeah, Svalbard. If they can move into the Atlantic, then we have a problem, because the United States would ship divisions, equipment, material over the ocean, over the Atlantic Ocean to Europe. And if you have Soviet submarines and Soviet frigates and Soviet cruisers all over the Atlantic, those supply transports, like the German U-boat in World War II, were at risk to be sunk. And you don't want to have a ship with 1,000 American troops to be sunk by a Soviet submarine in the Atlantic. So the British really focused on defending the Atlantic from the Soviets. And that's why the British Navy, after the United States Navy, was by far the biggest navy in the NATO forces. Not only the command that would have defended the North Atlantic against the Soviet was in Norfolk, UK, and it was headed by Norfolk was the American command for the Over Atlantic, and the North Atlantic command was, where was it? In Northwood, sorry, almost same name, in Northwood in the UK. So in the Northwood UK was the command that would it was a British command assigned to NATO, so the task to defend the North Atlantic and the Central Atlantic would fall to the British. And they had British admiral who led this command from Northwood. There were some two more commands. One was for the North Atlantic, Scotland, and the other one was in Plymouth for the Central Atlantic. There was a submarine force that the UK commanded. There were some land commands in Iceland and on the Faroes that the Brits commanded. No, Iceland was American, I think, and Faroe might have been the Danish. I have to check. There are so many commands that NATO had in the Cold War that were disbanded, which is a complete tragedy, because right now the NATO wouldn't be able to defend itself if it came, to an attack from the Russians. And what the British also focused on at the end of the Cold War was a massive amount of air power. Second biggest air force in NATO at the end of Cold War was the British Royal Air Force by far, with three specific tasks that the Royal Air Force had. So one of the Royal Air Force tasks at the end of the Cold War was a maritime patrol aircraft to look in the North Atlantic for Russian submarines. So there was in Scotland a whole British maritime group looking with Nimrods and Buccaneers and various Jaguars and so on to sink Russian ships trying to go into the Atlantic. There was a British huge combat group that was tasked with in Germany, right? With I think 5-6 air bases to help defeat the Soviets if they would invade West Germany. There was a British Strike Command, a group in south of England, which was tasked with basically using bomber force, tornadoes, and whatever they had, Vulcans and so on, to bomb Soviet forces in Germany flying out from the UK. Why? Because in that case, you put the British bases out of the range of the Soviets. And there was a smaller command that was tasked with defending the UK against Soviet bomber attacks. So as you can see, the UK at the end of the Cold War focused on the North Atlantic, air power, and they still had 4 divisions in Germany, which was a key force. To the south, there was a Belgian corps. To the north, there was a Dutch and a German corps. And that was the North German Defense Forces, the North German Army Group, headed by a British general. And the Brits provided almost all the rear area troops for this army group of NATO. So if we look at today what the UK needs, it has the same tasks. We don't expect the UK to bring up 5 divisions to Poland. 1 will be enough, a well-trained, well-equipped, heavy armored division, which the UK cannot provide at this point. Because it needs to have 3 brigades, and in the best case scenario, the Brits can put up maybe 2 armored brigades plus the parachute brigade. What is a danger for Europe is, again, the North Atlantic, because right now the only force defending that are the Norwegians. And the Brits need to go back, like in the Cold War, to help close that to Russian shipping and submarines. That means the UK needs more submarines. That means the UK needs more frigates. There are plans in place to build up more frigates, but they will come online like in 10 years, which is a little bit late. So my advice would be invest in more anti-submarine frigates, invest in more maritime patrol planes, bring back a dedicated strike force with anti-ship missiles flying out of Scotland with the maritime patrol planes to hunt Russian submarines and Russian ships, have more attack submarines to help make a you know, the plan was for American and British submarines to make a complete chain, 2 chains of submarines between Greenland and Norway, and not let any Russian submarine, Soviet submarine or Soviet ship pass these 2 chains of submarines. Today, the Brits couldn't do it anymore because they went from 30 plus something submarines to 7 submarines. So the UK needs more submarines, the UK needs more frigates, the UK needs more maritime air power. Next thing, what the UK provided to NATO in the Cold War was over like 800, 900 combat planes, right? The UK today is barely 150 combat planes, because as they introduced the F-35, the divesting, taking out of service Eurofighters. So please, the UK needs to invest more into air power. Buy more Eurofighters, buy more F-35A, and buy tankers, because flying from the UK to North Germany, you don't need to fuel up your fighter jets. Flying them from the UK to Eastern Poland, they need to be fueled up. So what Europe expects, what the United States expects from the UK is 1 armored division, air power and sea power, because the British always excelled at sea power and air power, and that is needed. And if you are the UK, if you have to ship a division from the UK to Poland, it takes time. If you have a navy and if you have an air force, you can be in the fight so much sooner than if you have to ship out the division. So my advice to the British is also, because you build your ships in the UK, start building and build more. The Royal Navy was the biggest navy in the world, and it's not anymore, not even any longer the biggest navy in Europe. The Italian Navy has surpassed it in size. So get your spot back as biggest navy in Europe. That's the first advice. Second, the French are having some 250 fighter jets. The UK is 100 below them. You know, pull equal with the French at least. Have 250 fighter jets with 50 earmarked for Scandinavia, Norway, to help defend that against the Russian Navy coming in from Murmansk, and also against attacks, and 200 to help in Poland and to defend NATO airspace.
Thomas, let me just briefly interject there, because this is a perfect transition to what we're about to be doing in 3 minutes. But I would like to use briefly the opportunity before we answer questions also from Driver and the likes. I'm sorry to interrupt, but I would like to highlight one thing, because Jade McGlynn wrote it a few minutes ago on her profile and from the center, from the CSS, and she put it very clearly. Kharkiv currently does not need our prayers. It does not need our, say, support in any shape or form other than with air power, and we do not have air power delivered at this point in time. We will be talking about exactly what you just said, investment in air power and the likes, but let's highlight why we're doing what we're doing at the moment. Also, Tracy, what are we currently doing for Kharkiv?
Thank you so much, Axel. Well, we have an amazing privilege and opportunity to be able to help power Kharkiv. So that's what we are trying to do. Of course, we can't power all of Kharkiv, but what we can do is purchase solar generators, and that's what we're fundraising for now. And these incredible generators are going to be powering hospitals and critical infrastructure like that. So we are having maximum impact on the amount of lives that we can help save, protect, and not just that, provide those critical services within the community so people can stay in Kharkiv, so Russia cannot basically have a Ukraine without Ukrainians, because that's what they are trying to do. That's what Russia is trying to do, and we cannot let them. So if you check out the first post in the nest, everybody, there is lots of information there about the amazing company that Mriya report is working with alongside the Kharkiv military administration to target, like I said, where these amazing generators, which absolutely incredibly, believe it or not, have also had the solar panels taken out to the firing range, and they've had bullets shot through them, 15 bullets to be precise, and they still worked. Of course, the current was reduced, but they still worked. And so that's really, really important to mention. And of course, they have a clean, stable, reliable supply, which is very, very important when we look at things like operating theatres. And you will see, if you look at that thread in the nest, scroll down through the information, and there are some videos attached there where these generators have been used previously in Kherson and in Kharkiv, and that's in part thanks to all you wonderful people here who helped to fundraise for that generator there. So thank you so much, Axel, for giving me time to tell everybody about our amazing opportunity. Click on that link there if you can donate, people, any amount, it doesn't matter. We have an amazing opportunity as a community here to put that power together, and we can then use that for so much good. So if you are in a position to donate, please consider donating, and if you're not, then retweet and reshare, because this is just as valuable. You never know who will see those posts that you make. And thank you so much, Axel.
Very much appreciated. Thank you, Tracy. So everybody, you know what to do. Click on the buttons, have a little look, see if there's anything you can give, please do so. And with that, Thomas, I'll be cycling you up as our guest co-host, because we need to make sure that we have enough space for everybody else. And let's go to one, whilst we do this, let's hear the question from Dryfly, and then we'll transition into more and more air power. Dryfly.
Yeah, and this can even transition into air power as well. I was going to ask Thomas, I went to a trade show about 5 years ago. This is between when Crimea kicked off and between the current war. And it was a UAV trade show. And I talked to, ironically, a Ukrainian engineer for a Ukrainian company who's selling UAVs. And his claim to fame was that theirs were extraordinarily autonomous, even at that point. And they were more for commercial applications, but he said they would work for military. And they would especially work well for things like protecting refineries, which is ironic given the current attacks by the Russians, because he was saying that having UAVs up with instrumentation actually pushes out the envelope for the other UAVs attacking. And he said that that's going to be the future of UAVs. And he mentioned a number of ways to do it, including that shotgun approach you discussed, where he says that you have a UAV that's armed with a shotgun-like cartridges, that as you get close to an incoming attack UAV, that you blast it out of the sky. But he said the most important part of the whole structure is going to be the information package in the vehicles and in the places being protected. And he predicted that tanks would be basically rolling information carriers as much as a vehicle with a barrel. And he said the same thing will happen with airplanes. And he says that the F-35 is the perfect example of a platform like that, which could, in effect, fly UAVs well out beyond their own radius and provide them with protection and with more ways to touch. Have you seen any efforts in that regard with Europeans? Because it's one way that they could leverage their current inventory without necessarily massively expanding manual defense systems. In other words, use more automation to at least buy them time. I'm not saying you can completely get away from putting more boots on the ground and more barrels in hands, but it would seem to be very much a force multiplier, both on the ground or in the air. And I'd love to hear your take, and also the guys from the pilots discuss that, because it would seem like just absolutely riveting talking to that Ukrainian engineer. And not surprisingly, most of the Americans who were with us in that meeting were not impressed. They kind of thought, who would ever want to do anything like that? That sounds like a lot of work, and it doesn't sound like it will pay off. And now we're looking at the Merkavas in Gaza, and we're hearing stories on the front in Ukraine, and it sounds like that guy was right on the nose. And I will listen. Thank you.
The guy was right on the nose. The thing is, when you make drones, UAVs, you know what the danger is to your product. So he pretty much understood exactly how someone could counter his product. And luckily for him, the Europeans are all not doing anything. Some Europeans have been licensed the Israeli trophy system and call it Euro trophy. But, you know, it's like, yeah, we will install it in the future one day. And I will be like, well, if you install it in the future, you will not have any tanks left to install it on. So right now, the Europeans should be producing 1,000 Euro trophy systems a year to slap it on every tank, infantry fighting vehicle we have. Nobody is doing anything in Europe. They're not even, like there's discussion that when you have the next tank that is being developed, the ground combat system that the Germans and the French are developing, yeah, then we will have all these systems in the tank in the future. In 10 years. And I'm kind of like, well, if you wait 10 years, it's not going to be of any use, right? Because let's just say Vladimir Putin is 71 and in 10 years he is 81 and he wants to invade countries before he's 80 because, you know, he wants to savor the victory and not invade and then die. So yeah, Europeans are way too slow and way too relaxed in everything here. And it's not really encouraging because if you're a soldier in Europe signing up to the military right now, you're not getting the best equipment, which makes signing up a little problem because, I mean, why would you want to sign up if you can tell that the governments are skimping on the protection of the troops? So F-35 is the first of a super modern networked information weapons system that completely provides the pilot with an immense amount of data about its surroundings. And if you look every fighter competition where different fighters had to fly against each other, be it in Switzerland, be it in Finland, the F-35 won hands down. So yes, Gripen E, a Eurofighter, Rafale, F-16, Block 70, F-15, AX, all nice fighters. But when a military has to choose the best product on the market, they're all sticking with the F-35 because its capabilities and avionics are just so. But I think Greg Bagwell speaks more with more depth of knowledge in this regard. So I will be now listening to him because when it's air power, I think the air marshal has a slight advantage in knowledge here. So I'm out.
Absolutely. That's okay. Thank you.